Welcome to One-on-One, the Daily Items weekly digital program, featuring Susquehanna Valley newsmakers, interviewed by Daily Item reporters. Today's guest is author Paul Metzger, interviewed by reporter Rick Dandis.
The Sunbury Motor Company.
Austin Martin, Kia Elite Sales Consultant, Maranatha Christian School.
Amber Wren, Certified Hyundai and Lincoln Sales Consultant, Seals Bavaria High School.
Ian Chikuski, Certified Ford Sales Professional, Mount Carmel and Shamokin area.
Christopher Stengline, Ford Certified Sales Consultant, Seals Bavaria High School.
Tom Mertz, fourth generation owner, Sunbury Motor Company, Shikellamy High School.
A tradition of trust since 1915.
Welcome to One-on-One. My name is Rick Dandis, and today we are speaking with Paul Metzger. Paul is the author of a book called Deeds of the Valley, which is the story of Elvira, a town in northern Union County, in the White Deer Valley, that no longer exists. Now, I have to confess that I first met Paul a couple of weeks ago at the campus theater when there was a showing of Surrender, which is the movie about Elvira. And much to my surprise, because I didn't know anything about it, it was completely sold out. So there's a lot of interest in the history of what happened, and I found it fascinating, so I'm glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
Paul, let's begin by, tell me a little about yourself. Obviously you're interested in history, and also I know that you have roots that harken back to Elvira.
Well, my journey started very, very young. My grandfather, Metzger, was a farmer, and he had started out over there on the ordnance grounds, part of the White Deer Valley. So our summers, we would go down and visit my grandfather, and I would hear these little stories. And then when I was 12, 13, and 14, he asked me to come help him farm on his dairy farm. Mm-hmm. It was there I would hear the stories about Dr. Metzger. Dr. Metzger was a very revered physician in the village of Elvira, which at the time I didn't know what Elvira was. And I would also hear the same stories of my great-grandmother Jarrett, who had been carried off her porch and her house destroyed by bulldozers that were standing by. So those two stories kind of always stuck to me as in my teenage years.
So there was no Elvira at that time?
Right, it was already gone.
Yeah.
But I had no clue where it was at.
Okay.
Nor did I have a clue what the ordinance was. I didn't learn about that till later on in life, really what it was all about. Mm. So that evolved for me into starting to study genealogy. The genealogy, the more I did on my family, drew me to the White Deer Valley. And it kept growing and growing. And then when I started putting Elvira, the ordinance, and my family together, it was addicting. I just couldn't get enough spare time to work on the project. So that's kind of where it's rooted from and where the passion exists. But I realized that I could share this story, my story, with so many other people.
All right, so let's put a spot on the map for people who might be watching this online. Elvira is, I guess, a little bit north of where Allenwood is now. That's called the White Deer Valley.
Right.
There was a thriving village at the time.
Right. It was a village that had a general store. At one time, it had a very short period of time, had a bar there until Gregg Township made it a dry township. There was a blacksmith there, a couple other shops. It was like many villages. You really can't say it's a town, it's more of a village, a cluster of homes. Of course, Dr. Metzger lived there. And usually these little...
grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
Okay.
Great-grandfather, Dr. Metzger. And this Elvira is just something that has really stuck. It's a very unique name, and it has actually become synonymous with the 8,600 acres, when if you look at the actual town, if you were to drive through it, what at that time was Route 44, formerly the Culberson Road, there was probably only 15 houses at best on this little short. But many times we generalize. If a post office exists in a particular location, then you generalize, okay, I'm from Elvira, when you might be a half a mile away, you might be a mile away.
Yeah.
So it kind of always evolves around a post office, which Elvira was at one time.
It had its own post office.
It started out as Wisetown, but its first official post office was Elvira, and that's when the name changed.
Okay, so the war broke out. What happened?
Well, it was March of '42, and there was already suspicion amongst many of the residents in the valley that something was going on. There were surveyors around, and people asked, they were told, well, we're building a new highway, or we're doing this, or we're doing that. And there was a lot of uneasiness. And finally, there was a notice that went out to attend a meeting at the Stone Church. By the way, it's the only standing building within the now prison grounds. There are only two other buildings that remained intact.
The Stone Church?
Yes,
Wow.
the Stone Church stayed. And that's not really in Elvira. It's actually a mile away. So it was there that they met, and they were informed that the government was going to build a munitions plant, and they had 6 weeks to leave. There was over 200 people in attendance, and they were just shocked and disbelief. They were living through and coming out of a depression, number one. They were sending their sons and daughters to war, and now they're told 6 weeks to leave. And this is where the story of my great-grandmother comes in, because her building, her home, gave way very quickly within that 6 weeks, because that's where the administration building for the ordinance was going to be constructed. So it happened early on. The sad part of it is, with all the family research and the good fortune I've had to have so many pictures and stories and documents, Bibles come my way because of my interest in my family, I never saw another smiling picture the rest of their life.
Wow.
So I've pretty much summed it up from the people I've interviewed as well as my family. Many of those families left with heavy hearts. I'm sure they probably didn't resist that much because, let's face it, we were at World War. Nobody really knew. You had German ships off the East Coast. You really didn't know what the potential was. So there was a conflict there between having to yield to a war effort and giving up their livelihood. But as I said, they left with heavy hearts, but they would die of broken hearts. Many of them did.
Yeah.
Now, for some, they turned their lives around. But for those that lost everything, like I have 4 direct ancestral lines that started out there from the 1830s throughout that whole 8,500 acres. So to have that many generations, and that many cousins and aunts and great
Wow.
uncles invested in that land, blood, sweat, and tears,
Wow.
to be suddenly told 6 weeks later, you've got to leave. You're gone.
Now, Paul, let's give some credit to your to Steve Huddy. A lot of this can be seen visually in his movie called Surrender, right? And that was also shown at the Campus Theater. So the both of you met, you worked together. You've told me previously that a lot of your research focused on the families, the real stories of the people
Right.
who live there. But for people who maybe are not aware of the entire story, what happened? They built a munitions plant. Just briefly tell us why they tore down Elvira.
Well, for that reason, it was a munition plant, and what part of the munition was actually the TNT. There was 2 lines that were to be constructed, and unfortunately, the 10 months it took them to build it, they barely got 3 or 4 of them started within the units before they started shutting them down. So it was very sad, to see that go away that quick. All these buildings had been constructed, the lands had been
How
contaminated.
many thousands of people came in? Do you know offhand?
From Steve's work, I believe his records show around 10,000 people.
10,000 people came in to work the munitions plant.
Right.
Which was only operational for about a year.
Right, about 10 months, and they started shutting it down immediately because as those saw the movie Surrender, the general that came in here that oversaw, got this thing started, he just finished the Pentagon, he comes in here to see this, and now he moves on and disappears, only to be later found out to be part of the Manhattan Project. So once you know that, you see why, okay, nobody really knew. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. As far as they had to keep making TNT because they didn't know how successful the Manhattan Project was going to be.
It's quite a story. We're talking with Paul Metzger. We'll be right back.
Sunbury Motor Company.
Austin Martin, Kia Elite Sales Consultant, Maranatha Christian School.
Amber Wren, certified Hyundai and Lincoln sales consultant, Selinsgrove Area High School.
Ian Chakosky, certified Ford sales professional, Mount Carmel and Shamokin area.
Christopher Stengline, Ford certified sales consultant, Selinsgrove Area High School.
Tom Mertz, fourth generation owner, Sunbury Motor Company, Shikellamy High School.
A tradition of trust since 1915.
We're back today with Paul Metzger, the author of a book called Deeds of the Valley. I want to show it to you. This tome is essentially the story of Elvira and the people who live there, and it goes all the way back, right, to.
I try to take the research back to the new purchase of 1768.
Okay.
And
So the 1768. So the town had been around for a couple hundred years, and it was destroyed. The town was essentially razed to the ground. A plant we talked about earlier in the earlier segment about how the government came in, built a munitions plant, and then left. And what happened to the people who were displaced?
well, many of them tried to start up new lives. Some of them would move half a state away to try to find ground that they could afford, because they only got pennies on the dollar. You had Washington bureaucrats coming up here and judging homes by maybe what they were living at, more
Yeah.
fancy, upkept homes.
Yeah.
But the homes that these people lived in, they protected them from the elements. You know, it was home. They were raising their crops and their animals, and they could sustain life there. So therefore, they were lowballed on the properties,
Yeah.
what they were got. So what happened then was many of them just couldn't make a go of it because they got so little,
Yeah.
and because you had over 160 some families
Oh, wow.
now
Wow.
seeking new land. Imagine what happened to the price.
Yeah.
And that's why, I know specifically for my family, they were pretty much poverty from there on. They were taken in. They had a little home. They moved down in Allenwood, but it wasn't much because they just didn't get enough for the land.
So I guess they weren't able to get enough farmland or
No.
afford farmland.
No, and the sad part of it is, this is one of the regrets I have with my project. I tried to capture everybody's history. And what I mean by everybody is, again, we were coming out of depression. I would say probably 30% of the inhabitants that were impacted by this were not landowners. Like my grandparents, they were tenement farmers. They were farming there for sharecropping, half the crop. And they're gone unless they own land or some kind of a documentation. I couldn't specifically identify them to a tract of land, which is what I'm trying to do. This book was a historical reference book that brings in what happened to someone's land, their genealogies, anything connected to the land that may draw them in and try to preserve this history. Because it's important to me that these generations that toiled these lands, blood, sweat, and tears,
Yeah.
that it's never forgotten. It can never be forgotten. There's lessons to be learned there. And it'll happen again. Unfortunately, if we don't pay attention to our history, we're resolved to repeat it. And hopefully people are more wary of what their government's doing and asking questions. One of those issues was, and it never changed, there was hardly a word that changed with all the people that Steve and I interviewed, as well as myself, knowing my family, where they were promised in that stone church that when the government was done with the land, they would get it back. That didn't happen. There was nothing in writing. The government denied it. I try to be careful when people say things. I need more documents, more
Yeah.
proof. But when
Yeah.
you consistently get the same statement from so many people, you know it to be true. And unfortunately, they were supposed to be, I guess there was like levels of 5 who would get the land. But it was pretty obvious in Steve and I's research, where we literally crawled around the grounds. I understood why the land never really could go back to a lot of people, because it was heavily contaminated. But there were areas that should have gone back. White Deer Golf Course, one of them. My family owned that from 1838.
Wow.
First, the 9-hole and where the clubhouse sits. They were in there then, and it should have gone back to them because it was outside the fence. It was in a buffer zone. It was outside the fence that was being patrolled. So that's kind of a bitter pill when you know that the land was still farmable.
Yeah.
And so what happened is the government started breaking it up. Some of the lands in the buffer areas would be put out for institutional use. So you had the Williamsport Recreation Committee or something like that in Williamsport, that's what it was at the time, had an opportunity to start the golf course. You had some go to Pennsylvania College of Technology, which is then Williamsport Area Community College.
Yeah.
You've got your Earth and Science building over there. Then you had some of it go to the Allenwood Prison Camp, where our Halderman and some of our famous Watergate people enjoyed their stay, if you will. I say that because there's some very interesting stories around their stay there. It was, if you're going to go to prison, this was the place to go. You had a golf course just down the street you could visit once in a while.
That's another story. It's very interesting. So if people want to read your book, it's available at the Union County Historical Society?
You can get it through the Union County Historical Society, the Muncie Historical Society, Montgomery Area Historical Society, and the Lycoming County Historical Society. Muncie Historical Society financed this project for me because it was more than I could undertake. But I want to make sure that the little bit of profit to be enjoyed is spread among all the areas that in some way or another were impacted, where relatives are still living, such as mine, that live still outside the lands. They didn't want to leave that valley. It was a precious place to live.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating story. Thank you for being here, Paul. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks for watching One on One. Be sure to tune in next week for another edition.